I remember when I first met Sarah. She was radiant and full of life. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and command everyone's attention. It's interesting how life can take that spark and gradually dull it. Our early days were full of laughter, shared glances, and nights spent talking until dawn. She had a lot of energy, which really inspired me. She had a way of making life seem worthwhile. It was worth putting in the effort back then. I was still just a young mechanic with grease-streaked hands and a heart full of ambition, and she loved me for it, or at least that's how it seemed. A decade later, life had settled into a more predictable, more routine rhythm. I was the guy who left for work before the sun had fully risen and came back when the street lights came on. The auto shop where I worked paid well enough, but it wasn't my own business. Every extra shift, every calloused hand was part of a quiet promise I made to myself. One day I'd have my own garage, a place where I could finally stand on my own 2 feet, master of my time, my craft, and maybe even my destiny. But dreams come at a price. Sometimes that price is the warmth you once shared over morning coffee or the simple touch of her hand when we passed each other in the hallway. Sarah's smile was becoming a rare thing. I don't recall when it started to disappear, only that one day I noticed it was gone. She was still gorgeous and full of life, but now it felt like I was only catching the afterglow of a setting sun. I was too tired and too busy with work and other commitments to ask why or look into it further. It was simpler to assume we were just busy and that this was what happened when two people built their lives around the same walls but moved at different speeds. I was too set in my ways to see what was really going on. The distance between us had grown until it felt like an ocean. When I got home, I'd find her sitting on the couch, eyes glazed over from a show she wasn't really watching or scrolling through her phone with that distant look that said she was somewhere else entirely. I'd greet her quietly and say something about dinner before heading off to change out of my grease-stained clothes. We still talked, but the conversations had become less frequent. We discussed practical matters like groceries and bills, as well as the neighbor's dog that kept barking. We never discussed our dreams or anything else personal. I learned to tune out the silence, just like I learned to ignore the dull throb in my hands after a day of tightening bolts and replacing worn-out parts. Our time together felt a bit too planned out. Date nights had become a thing of the past, replaced by her quick mentions of going out with. The girls needed some space, and I thought it was good for her. It was a way for her to unwind while I worked under fluorescent lights, putting in the hours like bricks toward the mythical garage of mine. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about needing some fresh air. It was about something you let slip through your fingers. But I kept telling myself she'd come back. I thought things would calm down. Maybe one day I'd finally walk into our home, toss my keys on the counter, and find her waiting for me with that old smile. But life isn't always so generous. It began with small changes that I didn't think much of at first. Sarah's schedule started filling up with evening classes and meetups with friends. She told me about a new fitness routine that she was excited about. She said it involved some high-intensity workouts to mix things up. I nodded and gave her a tired smile as I wiped oil from my hands after another double shift. "That's good," I said, feeling as mechanical as the parts I'd been working on all day. I thought she deserved a break and a life outside of our increasingly monotonous home. But over time, she started going out more often, and the number of hours she spent away. The workouts and casual drinks with friends were longer than they used to be. I was coming home to an empty house more often than not. The silence was a bit of an unwelcome guest. Dinners that used to be shared at the table turned into meals eaten alone at the kitchen sink or reheated leftovers at the TV. The couch still had the impression of her sitting there, like a ghost of her presence that lingered as I'd watch the clock, waiting for the soft rattle of keys in the door. "How was your night?" I'd ask when she finally got back. Her smile was always a little forced, and her answers were brief and evasive. "Good," she'd say, already heading to the bedroom, brushing past my attempts at conversation like it was no big deal. The weekends were our time, a sacred space carved out amidst the chaos of work and responsibilities. We'd go for drives. If we're out of town, we'll find a diner with affordable coffee and a slice of pie. Or we'll spend a relaxed afternoon together reading a book while I work on some old car parts on the porch. Nowadays, those days are filled with new plans and spontaneous outings. She'll announce on her way out, "I'm meeting the girls," and she'll grab her purse and leave, leaving me with the sound of the door clicking shut each time a little louder in my ears. At first, I told myself this was just a phase everyone goes through. I put it down to my work schedule, which was intense and left me with little energy by the time I got home. But when I saw her getting ready, spending more time in front of the mirror and carefully choosing her clothes, I started to feel a bit down. She looked happy and full of life, which I hadn't seen in months. I wasn't sure if it was just because of the nights out or something else. It's interesting how easily routine can become a mask for something deeper. She'd give me pecks on the cheek, fast and cold, the kind that don't linger. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling while she texted in the dark, the glow from her phone casting sharp shadows across her. I picked up bits and pieces of their conversation here and there, along with laughter and murmurs. I told myself it was innocent, but doubt is a sneaky thing, even when you try to get rid of it. The distance between us wasn't just emotional. It was physical, too. When we did talk, it was just polite exchanges, without the warmth and teasing we used to have. We lived together, but not as a couple. I didn't ask. I should have asked more questions, but I was afraid of what I'd find out. Maybe the woman who once made me feel invincible found more joy elsewhere. Or maybe I already had an inkling of what was going on and just wasn't ready to face it. I first noticed the discrepancies by accident. Sarah had mentioned meeting her friends for dinner at a new restaurant downtown. That night, as I was sitting on the couch scrolling through social media, I saw a photo that was tagged by one of her friends. The caption said, "Girls' night out, laughs, and cocktails at the loft." The background wasn't the upscale spot she said it was. It was a dark bar, one we used to go to years ago. I couldn't help but stare at it. I saw a photo of Sarah and her friends at a bar. I had a feeling something was off. Maybe she forgot to tell me she was going to a different place. But I didn't think much of it at first. As time went on, I noticed more strange occurrences. She'd say she was going to a late workout, but her stories didn't quite add up. The discrepancies were minor. Sometimes her post would go up at the wrong time, or she'd mention something that didn't quite add up when she was telling me about her evening. I began to put the pieces together. My mind made connections that I tried to ignore. After all, there hadn't been any reason for me to doubt her. I was just imagining things. It was a trick played on me by exhaustion and the slow grind of work. I was more paranoid than perceptive. My logical side told me I was being silly. I'd come home with sore muscles and my head was all clouded up from the day's work. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was overthinking everything. "You're tired, Alex," I told myself as I washed the grime off my hands at the kitchen sink. I was trying to get rid of more than just the oil. It felt easier and safer to just push my worries to the back of my mind. After all, if I told Sarah what I was thinking, it would make me think it was true, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But the tension became harder to ignore each time I glanced at her phone on the coffee table or heard it buzz late into the evening. My chest tightened, and I found myself watching her pick up her phone with a guarded expression and turn away from me. The laughter that once seemed genuine now sounded forced. She didn't quite meet my gaze when she spoke. I told myself it was all in my head. I was so stressed at work that I was making problems where there weren't any. But whenever I tried to dismiss my thoughts, it only led to more questions. One night, I couldn't get to sleep. I was lying in the dark, listening to her breathing beside me. It should have been a comforting experience. It was a bit strange sharing a bed after so many years, but it didn't feel like it was really happening. I thought about the evenings she said she was with her friends, the photos, and the places that didn't quite add up. I clenched my jaw and tried to convince myself that my doubts were just because I was tired. I thought I'd be able to figure it all out if I just let it go. But doubt is a relentless voice in your head that doesn't go away just because. The worst part was the guilt. I felt like I was betraying her trust by questioning her loyalty. I was starting to see shadows where there were none. I was starting to feel like I was turning into the man I'd always feared. Bitter, suspicious, and unable to trust the woman I once knew better than anyone. I was trying to tune out the noise in my head, but it just kept getting louder. I was too afraid to ask questions. The evening began as usual. When I got home, the house was empty and the lights were dim. The hallway lamp gave off a soft glow that barely reached the living room, casting long, quiet shadows that seemed to creep. I flopped into the old armchair, wiped out from another long day at the garage. It wasn't long before Sarah came in, looking a bit wobbly. I watched her with a mix of concern and annoyance as she fumbled to take off her heels, a smile on her lips, before muttering something I couldn't quite make out. She went down the hallway towards the bathroom. I could hear the shower start, the steady stream of water covering her muffled hums and soft splashes. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter, where it had been carelessly discarded. The counter buzzed once, then again, and the screen lit up with an alert. I don't usually check her messages, even though I had some doubts. I respected her privacy, but there was something about this moment, the buzz in the silent room, and the sharp contrast between her carefree stumble and the questions that had been on my mind for weeks. It got me up out of the chair. I reached for her phone, feeling a bit hesitant as I moved slowly. The message was from Sarah's number, but it wasn't meant for me. "Hey, I forgot to send you our video. I'd like to spend more time with you, now that there's plenty of time." I was surprised by how little of you there was. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked at them again and again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My heart started racing with each beat, thundering in my ears as I clicked to open the attachment. What I saw on the screen made me feel really uneasy. The video was pretty clear. I saw that it was another man. The room was filled with evidence of betrayal. It was definitely sexual. In that moment, I realized how much was at stake. I was frozen in place, overwhelmed by a rush of shock. Everything felt surreal. The kitchen, the photos on the fridge, the sound of the floorboards beneath my feet. It was like I was looking at my life through a broken lens. My body moved on its own, and I dropped the phone on the counter with a shaking hand. I wanted to scream and break something, but I felt stuck and suffocated. Next came anger, followed by a searing heat that burned through. I felt numb. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought it might break, and I curled my fists until my nails bit into my palms. I had to look away from the phone. I moved around the kitchen as if looking for something to hold on to before the storm inside me caused everything to fall apart. My mind was racing with questions that only made me more upset. How long had this been going on? Who was he? How could she do this to me? All the trust we'd built up over the years was gone, replaced by the painful realization that we'd been betrayed. I could still hear her laugh from earlier that night, distorted and cruel. I could also hear the sound of water running in the bar bathroom. I felt like I was looking at things from a distance, as if it were a different world, a different life. I walked back and forth between the counter and the sink, breathing deeply, trying to calm down enough to think clearly. I had to fight the urge to storm into the bathroom and confront her every second. I had to fight the rage that threatened to overwhelm me. It felt like I was a stranger in my own home, surrounded by the everyday objects of a life that now felt like a lie. In the quiet hum of the house, which held both our secrets and shattered dreams, I stood with the realization that everything had changed and there was no going back. I looked at the dark screen of Sarah's phone. The storm in my chest began to settle, making way for something colder and more calculated. The initial shock and rage had passed, and I was left with a kind of numb clarity that sharpened my focus. I knew that charging into the bathroom and demanding answers while emotions were running high would just make things more chaotic. If I was going to confront this, I needed to do it in a way that made sense to me, with a clear head and a plan. I put the phone back on the counter, making sure not to leave any trace that I had touched it. The background noise of running water gave me a chance to catch my breath and get my thoughts in order. My mind was racing with a lot of thoughts, but I tried to make sense of them and turn them into something I could do. I sat at the kitchen table, drumming my fingers as I considered various possibilities. I knew Sarah would be done with her shower soon, and when she was, I needed to act like nothing had changed, even though it would be really tough. I took a look at the framed photos on the wall. The two of us, smiling on a beach trip years ago. I remembered how her eyes crinkled at the edges when she was laughing. It was almost surreal how those memories felt like relics of a different life. But they were useful in helping me decide on a way forward. I had to keep my emotions in check and make a rational decision. I had to stay on task. If you want to stay one step ahead, you have to take it one step at a time. The first thing I needed to do was take a look at the situation. If I made my move now, I'd lose the element of surprise, which was crucial. I needed to find out who this guy was, how deep this betrayal went, and whether there had been other lies. As I thought about what I thought I knew, my instincts as a mechanic kicked in. My years of diagnosing problems piece by piece meant I was ready for this. It was all about precision and patience, and every detail mattered. I had a plan. I'd play it cool, keep up the act of being an unsuspecting husband, and gather information. Over the next few days, I'd keep a close eye on her, noting the calls she took, how her behavior changed, and any other details that would help me understand what was going on. I'd use my phone to keep a record of anything she might unknowingly leave behind. If she noticed my silence or distance, I'd just say I was busy with work. The long hours at the garage were a good excuse for not paying attention to what was going on. I thought about getting her phone back, but that would be risky. One wrong move and the whole thing would come crashing down. I needed to think this through more carefully. There were ways to get her data without raising suspicion, and I'd use every resource available. To make sure she didn't find out, I needed to find out who the man in the video was. His identity could be the leverage I need, whether it's for answers, confrontation, or something else. When the water shut off, I straightened up, forcing myself to look neutral and pushing down the frustration that rose in my throat. I resisted the temptation to confront her right then and there. This was going to be a long game. As I heard her footsteps and saw her appear in the hallway wrapped in a towel, I met her eyes and gave her a tired smile. "It had been a long day," she asked, her voice light and casual, unaware of the storm she had caused. I replied in a calm, collected manner, just as I always do. Inside, I was already trying to calm down and use my anger to fuel what was about to come next. I watched her pad into the bedroom, leaving a faint scent of her shampoo in the air. The night went by in uncomfortable silence. The distance between us was growing with each passing hour, but I was unfazed. I was going to keep up the pretense and move the plan forward one step at a time. The next morning, I woke up with a clear plan of action. I spent the night thinking through each detail of the plan while I lay next to Sarah, looking into the dark. She shifted in her sleep, unaware of the new version of me that had emerged. I could smile, joke around, and even seem concerned, all while keeping what was going on inside a secret. I got up as usual, made coffee, and went through my usual routine. Each step reinforced the facade I was presenting. When Sarah finally joined me, her hair still damp from the shower, I waited for the right moment to bring up the issue. It came when I reached for the sugar jar. I nudged her phone with my elbow just enough that it fell off the counter and hit the floor with a sharp crack. The sound cut through the morning quiet and startled her. "Oh, Alex, be careful," she said, sounding a little exasperated as she picked it up, wincing at the broken screen. I gave her my best, "I'm sorry" look, holding up my hands like I was surrendering. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Let me make it up to you. Whatever you need, I'll take care of it." She seemed a bit surprised at my insistence, but not suspicious. The Alex she knew was very practical, not one to fuss over electronics or offer to buy a new gadget without a good reason. She said, "A little excitement is breaking through." I nodded, playing the part of the forgetful, clumsy husband. The husband was eager to make amends and got through the rest of the morning quickly. I watched her carefully pick out clothes, and it seemed like her mood lifted at the thought of shopping. It was almost insultingly easy to slip back into normal. Later that day, she looked through the store displays with a sales associate. I felt the tension in my chest as I thought about models and features. This was my chance, and I had to move fast with her old phone tucked into my pocket. It was cracked but still usable. I went outside to where the signal was strong. I used the app I'd set up on my own phone the night before. It launched without any issues and pulled in the necessary data. I could see from her phone that photos, messages, and contacts were transferring over. I felt a bit betrayed, even though it was pretty obvious. I glanced back through the store's glass window and saw her smile as she tested a new phone. She was completely unaware of how the minutes were passing. I could feel my heart beating faster with each passing second as I watched the progress bar inch across the screen. Once it was done, I put her damaged phone back in my pocket and went back to the store. I timed it so I walked in just as she glanced up and waved me over to take a look. I nodded in approval, adding a light-hearted touch to defuse any remaining tension. "It looks like I won't drop this one." She laughed and swatted at me playfully, and just like that, the moment passed. The only sound in the kitchen was Sarah breathing in her bedroom. I sat alone at the table, the light from a street lamp casting an eerie glow through the blinds in my hand. It was Sarah's old phone, the screen cracked from the accident. It had been broken on purpose to reflect my current state of mind. I had already got what I needed from it, but tonight it would finally be put to use. I found the contact I was looking for, the one I had seen in countless exchanges. I sent him a message that I had forced myself to endure. I hesitated for a moment before typing, "If you want to see more of my videos, which I've made with you in mind, please make a payment. Think of it as an investment in our fun." I hit send without a second thought. The seriousness of my message hung in the air. I took a seat and waited. The seconds stretched out, and I couldn't help but imagine how he'd react. Would he think it was funny? Would he be taken aback by the unexpected request? Or would he take a moment to process the change in tone? I got a reply on my phone. "You're really something tonight. What's got into you?" His words were full of the arrogance of someone who thought they knew it all. I clenched my teeth and tensed my muscles as I read his playful reply. He had no idea, no inkling that he was now involved in a much larger game. I took a slow breath and started typing the next message, making sure every word hit home. "You don't understand, do you? I've got all your videos and photos, and trust me, what you're hiding isn't impressive. If you want to keep this under wraps, you'll have to make a payment. Otherwise, you're going to have to face the music." The silence that followed was pretty intense. The atmosphere was getting more and more tense with each passing second. This time, he took a longer pause before he replied. I could almost feel his heart racing as he read and reread the message. It finally sank in that this wasn't just a bit of harmless flirting, but a serious threat. The phone buzzed again. This time, I was more confident. "Who's this? What's the deal here?" I leaned forward and pressed the keys a bit harder than necessary. "It's not a game. You'll need to transfer the money, or there'll be consequences. Just so you know, everyone you know will see what you've been up to." The message was straightforward and to the point. A few moments later, a notification appeared. "Transfer it" was small, almost laughable in its insignificance. a tentative show of compliance. He was trying to see how things would play out, to see if this would solve the problem. I clenched my jaw as I stared at the screen. The rush of victory was mixed with a bit of frustration. He still thought he could take control of this, take control and manage it on his terms. I put the finishing touches on the message for the night, one that would make it clear this was a warning. Next time, be prepared to pay the price. You have 24 hours, or everything will be made public. I put the phone away, feeling the cool metal beneath my palm as I placed it back in the drawer. I could still feel my heart beating fast in my chest. I was still feeling the effects of the adrenaline, like fire coursing through my veins. The house had taken on a different feel. The familiar shadows cast by the hallway lamp seemed to shift as if they were aware of. I sensed a shift in the atmosphere. I got up and walked to the bedroom, feeling like each step was taking me further away from the situation. Sarah was curled up under the blanket, unaware of the situation I'd put her in. Her betrayal had created a path, and I was no longer willing to let it fester in silence. I got under the covers and looked at the ceiling, still thinking about what I'd just done. I felt a strange, unsettling calm wash over me, like I'd just done something big. This wasn't just about getting revenge. It was a calculated move, a step toward reclaiming control in a life that had spun wildly out of balance. The air felt colder and sharper, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The minutes ticked by, but I couldn't get to sleep. I listened to the night sounds, the clock ticking, the leaves rustling outside, and the woman's steady, unknowing breathing beside me. I'd taken the first step, and there was no turning back. The game was on, and I was ready to see it through, no matter where it led. The phone in my hand was still warm from the last message, hanging in the void between silence and chaos. I sat there, still, waiting for the only confirmation that mattered. The house was quiet, and I felt like it was pressing in around me, making it feel thick and suffocating. The fridge was humming, and I could hear the floorboards creaking every so often. The longer I looked at the screen, the more I could feel my pulse, steady but strong, beating in my temples. At last, the phone vibrated, a sharp, insistent buzz. I glanced at it. I got a notification that the transaction was complete. The amount matched what I'd asked for. He paid right away, just like I'd been hoping and then worrying for a moment. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I was thrilled and relieved. All done. He backed down because he was afraid. It showed he valued his reputation more than his connection with Sarah. I took a moment to let the confirmation sink in. I moved on to the next step, which had to be done right. I quickly changed the settings to block his number with just a tap of my thumb. The contact was gone from her phone, and the link was broken as if it had never been there. As I sat back, it felt like the room shifted a little. I could feel the weight of what I'd done settling over me like a thick blanket. The anger and betrayal had fueled this act, and now that it was complete, I felt a strange emptiness where that fire had been. However, I couldn't afford to dwell on it. To get out of there quickly, I needed to make sure I didn't leave any evidence. I deleted the entire conversation on the messages, one message at a time, to make sure there was no trace. I checked the phone and saw that everything was deleted, as if the night's events had never happened. I could wake up from it. Sarah shifted in the bedroom, and I froze. I heard her sigh and settle deeper into sleep. My adrenaline surged again, reminding me that while this step was a good one, the night wasn't over. I stood up and went back to the drawer where I'd put her phone. The drawer closed quietly, and I took a moment to calm my breathing. I leaned against the cool countertop and noticed the house getting bigger and emptier. The space between walls seemed to stretch out in the quiet aftermath. I went back into the bedroom. The shadows were familiar, but there was a sense of knowing what I'd done. Sarah was lying on her side, facing the wall, breathing steadily, and there was a small lock of hair falling. She looked relaxed and at peace, lying there so calmly. I just couldn't picture her as the woman in the messages, the one who'd shared laughs and secrets with another man. But tonight, I didn't have to. Tonight was about taking back control, and I did just that. I got back under the covers and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. I took a look at the account where the money had been transferred. I wanted to verify that it was legitimate. This wasn't just a moment of bravado. It was proof that I had made him an offer he couldn't refuse. I felt a sense of grim satisfaction settle in my chest. I finally put my phone down. The quiet fell again, like a weight on me. But I felt like I was in a different place now. I wasn't just a victim of betrayal anymore. I had stood up for myself. I had reclaimed something. The game had changed. Everything fell into place. And finally, I was able to get some sleep. I knew that tomorrow would bring a different kind of silence. The first light of dawn crept into the room, casting a pale glow across the floorboards and emphasizing the silence between us. I lay there for a moment, eyes wide open, looking at the ceiling as I thought about what had happened the night before. My body was still tense, with muscles that had been coiled from the surge of adrenaline that had finally ebbed in the small hours before sunrise. As the world came to life around me, I felt Sarah move and stretch. Her hand brushed mine, a soft, instinctive gesture that once might have made me feel a little more optimistic. Now, it only reinforced my decision. She turned to face me, her eyes half closed and lips curving into a sleepy smile. It was a smile I'd seen a lot, one that used to signal the start of shared mornings and whispered jokes. Today, it was a stark reminder of the lies she'd buried beneath that familiar expression. Before she had a chance to say anything, I sat up. As the bed shifted under the weight of our bodies, I said, "We need to talk." My voice was calm and controlled, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion that deepened into something more guarded. "What's up?" she asked, propping herself up on one elbow. Her voice had a cautious tone to it. I could see her looking at me, trying to figure me out. She was trying to look innocent, but I could tell she was hiding something. If I'd taken a deep breath and kept my cool, I could have handled it. I knew Sarah, and I knew everything there was to know about her. I said what I had to say, but it didn't seem to register with her. Her face went pale, and her eyes got wide. It was as if she'd been caught in a sudden, blinding light, and a silence followed that seemed to stretch on forever. It was like being in a thick, suffocating fog. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, then opened again as she tried to find the right words. "Alex, it's not what you think," she finally said. tears welling up and spilling over her cheeks before she could wipe them away. I was completely undone the first time I saw her crying. It felt like a ghost of a past that no longer existed. I interrupted, I said, sounding more tired than angry. I don't want to hear any excuses. She got up from the bed and pulled herself up with a kind of desperate urgency. Please let me explain. Her voice was soft and pleading, cracking a little as she reached for my arm. I took a step back, and her hand landed in the space where I had been. The tears came harder now, her chest heaving with shallow, frantic breaths as she came to terms with the situation. I was lonely, Alex. She stuttered out the confession, feeling guilty and regretful. You were always at work, never around. I could hear the pain in her voice as she tried to explain her actions. I felt a chill run through me as I watched her fall apart. I could see the hurt and betrayal, but I felt detached from it. I tried to help her out, but I ended up coming across as a bit cold. This isn't about me, I said. You're putting in extra hours at work, or you and Sarah are growing apart. This is about the choices you make. You need to leave. Her eyes met mine, and she looked like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. The panic gave way to a roar of fear that was completely raw and unfiltered. Alex, please don't do this. We can work through this. We can. I interrupted her with a firm gesture, unable to listen to the lies disguised as hope. No, Sarah. I told her to pack her things and leave. Each word was final and unyielding. The room felt smaller as we processed the impact of those words. She stood there for a moment, looking at me to see if I'd changed my mind, but I hadn't. With a sob, she turned and stumbled toward the closet. The silence seemed to punctuate the moment. I watched her pack her things, bags filled with trembling hands, as she opened and closed drawers. I was completely detached from the gravity of this moment, the life we had built together, and the memories we shared. As she moved through the room, each item she packed was a small reminder of what we once were. When she finally left, the front door closed quietly. The house fell into a silence deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. In the quiet, I sat alone. I kept thinking about the words divorce and end. As the morning sun climbed higher and cast its indifferent light across the empty spaces she left behind, I found myself going through the motions of my life like an automaton, fixing cars by day and filling the silence of the house with the low hum of the television at night. The money I had forced from her lover sat untouched for weeks, as if acknowledging its existence meant admitting to the lengths I'd gone to reclaim control. But gradually the sharp sting of betrayal began to morph into something else. A drive, a desire to rebuild what had been my dream. This time, I was able to refocus on my own auto shop with a new sense of urgency. During those months, I was putting all my anger and pain into plans, sketching out budgets, and calculating costs late into the night. The money from the extortion, along with the savings I'd put aside over the years, became the starting point. I did some research on locations, visited some rundown garages that smelled of oil and rust, looking for one that I could transform into something great. The work was tough, and there were days when I was exhausted, but it was different from the pain of betrayal. This was a choice, something I could shape with my own hands. 2 years went by in a blur of paperwork, permits, and renovations. I located the old garage on the outskirts of town. The old garage I'd found on the edge of town got a makeover, and now it's a clean, modern auto shop, gleaming under its new coat of paint. When I flipped the open sign to face the street on the first day, I felt a real sense of accomplishment. I stood in the middle of the shop, taking in the smell of new tires and fresh paint, and the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. It was more than that, really. It was just a business, but it showed that I had rebuilt and fought my way back from the brink with nothing but determination and the painful fuel of old wounds. Word got around pretty slowly at first, just through word of mouth. I was getting too much work to handle on my own, so I hired a couple of young mechanics who were eager and ready to learn. I was reminded of my own experience when I first picked up a wrench and watched them work. I felt a strange pride, seeing a reflection of my own journey in their enthusiasm. The garage became like a second home to me. I spent more time there than anywhere else, putting my heart and soul into every repair. I heard from mutual friends and saw a glimpse of Sarah in town, but it told a different story. The man she had risked everything for had disappeared. I hadn't anticipated the fallout from the photos and videos I'd shared anonymously with his contacts, which left his life in chaos. She did it out of spite, but also as a warning and a statement that actions have consequences. Sarah was on her own now, haunted by regret. She tried to pick up the pieces in her own way, but it was clear from the look in her eyes when she saw me across the street that she was still reeling from what she'd lost. I heard through the grapevine that she'd spoken to friends, admitting to mistakes and trying to piece together a life that was still affected by what could have been. I heard that she'd opened up to friends about her missteps and was trying to put the pieces of her life back together, even though she was haunted by what might have been. I felt a little sorry for her, but I also knew that we were both living with the consequences of our choices. Of the choices we'd made, regret was a powerful teacher, but it was one she now had to face alone. On the rare nights when the shop was quiet and the lights were off, I'd think back to what we used to have. I'd think of the laughter that used to fill our home and the quiet moments we spent sharing dreams. Those memories were a bit hazy. Like old photos left in the sun, they were more reminders of who I once was than what I missed. My life is different now. It was built on resilience and a realistic understanding of what it took to get here. Sometimes I wondered if she regretted it all. Did she still feel the same pain from losing me? I'd been through something similar. I never lingered on it for too long. I learned that building something lasting comes not just from the strength of love, but also from knowing when to walk away to claim what's left and turn it into something new. As I stood in the garage, surrounded by the sounds of ratchets clicking and engines rumbling, I knew that I had found my way forward. The past was still there, part of who I was, but it wasn't defining me anymore. While Sarah's regret became the silence between us, it was like we were living with an echo of choices we could never undo. The day started like any other, with the garage filled with the steady rhythm of tools. The early afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the pristine workstations that had become my sanctuary over the past 2 years. I was under the hood of a pickup, listening to the deep, familiar hum of the engine. When the quiet comfort was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and a car door slamming hard enough to make everyone pause and glance up. I was still processing what was happening when he stormed in. He was red with rage, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and his fists were clenched as he looked around the room. It took me a moment to recognize him. He was clean-cut, but his appearance was disheveled. He was the guy from the videos. He was the lover who thought he could stay in the background of our lives. He yelled my name, and the sound bounced off the metal walls and silenced the whole shop. His voice was strained with a fury that teetered on the edge of. Before I could react, he rushed over to a nearby workstation and knocked over a tool chest, sending wrenches clattering to the ground. Things got pretty chaotic. My mechanic backed away, yelling for him to stop. Some of the others were too stunned to move. I stepped forward and held my hands up in a calm, reassuring manner. "My face, you need to leave," I said, each word measured but low. It only seemed to make him angrier. "You ruined my life," he said angrily, grabbing a metal bar and slamming it against a set of shelves. The clatter echoed like gunshots, cutting through the air before he could do more damage. My colleagues moved in to restrain him, pinning him against a workbench. I suggested he call the police. I was surprised at how calm I was. One of the younger mechanics picked up his phone and started dialing. The intruder was thrashing around and shouting, spitting out words. He tried to extort me. He screamed and looked from face to face, trying to find someone who would believe him. I knew what really happened. There were no messages left, no proof whatsoever. He was just trying to make it look like I was covering my tracks. The police were on the scene in no time. The police arrived quickly, their lights flashing and casting blue and red glows over the scattered tools and metal debris. They handcuffed him and took him into custody. He slumped, glaring at me with a mix of hatred and defeat. I met his gaze without flinching, knowing that the damage he'd done today would cost him more than just pride. The police took statements, looked over the wreckage, and shook their heads at the mess that was my workshop. One of the officers told me that charges could be filed for property damage. As I watched the intruder being led away, I realized that this wasn't the end of it for him. This wasn't over for him by a long shot. The repairs to the shop would be a hassle, but it would be satisfying to know he'd face consequences beyond what I'd originally planned. I couldn't help but see the irony in it. The guy who thought he could just walk into someone's life and walk away unscathed was now tied up. He'd have to pay the price in ways he hadn't anticipated. As I stood amidst the aftermath, the metal shards glinting under the harsh fluorescent light, I knew that this would be something I'd overcome. I'd be stronger, more determined, and a reminder that some victories are earned in the aftermath.